No, that's freaking me out too. If I leave in the middle of this, I'm having some kind of spiritual ideological.
I guess it does make more sense to have a blackboard be in the front of the room than on the side of the room.
As a classroom, yeah.
Yeah.
But as our room,
Really?
Did you succeed?
That is the worst.
I don't see anybody.
Yeah.
And then there's a kind of like a wall, and then the doors are this weird inset thing.
Yeah.
Bump that out. So we're gonna put it in the work order today. Next week. We'll send you a card today.
Good. I got Derrida, and he goes back. But what it does is I'm not exactly sure what he was looking for.
Articles
About pinching or about
serialization, but
in
about
general.
more along the like post-9/11 periodization and how that's
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So that's useful. That was not me.
Okay. I don't know. I could drop by here on to talk about it more.
Yeah, that's up to you. But I'll write this before that. Or even this weekend. I think we're looking for references work on pinching. There's a ton of work on history and pinching, showing something. I don't really know what it's about. Yeah, one is called Thomas Pynchon, Darkness. And then also there's a new reader volume on against the death. So you might want to look at that just to look at what's there. Like a corrupted tone style.
I've wanted to do
Oh, yeah. So you know what you're saying, but I can do this other stuff on the
Okay.
Even that, yeah, that's to look at as dated as what you have in. No,
okay, now we can commence. Thank you all for coming. Let's see. I was going to say this was our last talk before the Anthropocene Feminism Conference, but it isn't. Our next event is Friday, April 4th. Stefan Helmrich will be speaking on the Anthropocene, something related to the Anthropocene. I don't have the titles with me. He's an anthropologist from MIT, is that right?
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm doing this without notes. Anyway, and then our conference on Anthropocene Feminism is the following weekend, Thursday, April 10th to 12th. Please register if you haven't. Registration is free, but without that you can't get into all of the free food that we're offering. So please register. Anyway, it's a real pleasure to introduce Jonathan Freedman today. Jonathan's someone whose work I've known for quite some time, and he's worked in not unrelated areas, a little bit later in American literature than I tend to work in. We became friends on Facebook. It's a social media romance, I guess you call it, social media romance, and have since been fortunate to spend some time together in various venues. Jonathan got his PhD from Yale in 1985, and he is currently, I think you have a title as professor.
Martin Feldman, collegiate professor.
and you're sort of obligated to say that wherever you go, right? He's the Marvin Feldheim Collegiate Professor of English and American Literature.
Studies and Jewish studies.
I almost had that, and Jewish Studies at University of Michigan. Jonathan's published 3 books, most recently Klezmer America, Jewishness, Ethnicity, Modernity, but before that, Temple of Culture, Assimilation, Aggression, and the Making of Literary Anglo-America, and his first book on Henry James, Professions of Taste, Henry James, British Aestheticism and Commodity Culture. It's also edited 4 books and is currently working on a project on Jewish decadence. We heard a little piece of that last night at the Jewish Studies talk, and this is not a piece. He's also published numerous articles, reviews, and so forth. Most recently, a really good account in the Chronicle of Education of MOOCs, and as MOOCs as being the sort of latest manifestation of American fascination with middlebrow culture. It's a really interesting historicization of the MOOC trend. Anyway, today he'll be talking to us about Sartre, Curtis, and the Cone.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming and for welcoming me into your intellectual community. It's been a great pleasure so far. I don't really have much to say about this talk, except to say that it's kind of me trying to sort of figure things out. So I'm totally thrilled if when we get to a Q&A afterwards, you could help me untangle myself into the various traps and webs that I seem to have managed to fall into various points of thought. I don't want to be a bummer about this, but I just heard that Helen Carter, who was the woman who made my career happen, died. Helen was the editor at Stanford University Press. I just was thinking about this as Richard was speaking. My first book had just been rejected soundly by Yale University Press. And Helen just sort of sat down and talked through it with me, and then a week later it was accepted, and I was actually able to get promoted. It's just one of those moments in life where you sort of feel like without her I wouldn't be here, and now she's not here anymore. And that's a very sad thing to do, but I also want to celebrate her and speak for a little bit in her memory. I hope I can be half as vibrant and intelligent as she was. So, a few weeks ago, I wrote Richard to tell him that I had second thoughts about the topic I proposed to speak on today. How many, after all, would share my interest in the signifying systems brought to bear in and around the figure in all senses of the word of the Jew? Wouldn't you all rather hear me dilate on another one of my obsessions, the long, illustrious intertwining of capitalism and the con, from Chaucer to American Hustle? If you haven't seen American Hustle, see, it's a great movie. Too late, Richard replied. Maybe I could fit my concerns into the theme of this year, namely changing climates. That sounds great, I replied. But you know, Richard, I said, somewhere it's always bad weather for Jews. Richard replied, well, Jonathan, some of us actually believe in history. My response, well, that's actually the problem. Underneath what is a characteristic Richard-Jonathan exchange, in which for once I managed to outbloom him, usually it's the other way around, lie a number of serious issues that lead to the theme of my talk. Richard's implication that I'm something of a structuralist is not entirely without reason. Although it's been my brief to write about the changing shape of Jews as they entered into the discourse systems of the West, my sense of Gentile anti-Semitism has led me to perceive a remarkable consistency over time and across cultures. So, for example, when I wrote a chapter in my book, Klezmer America, about the Left Behind series of Christian eschatological thrillers, do you all know what I'm talking about? Arguing that although these testaments of the Christian right are ostensibly philo-Semitic, anti-Semitic tropes, figurations, and obsessions are reproduced in its narrative of a Svengali-like Romanian-born Antichrist. I called the chapter, with a flourish, Anti-Semitism Without Jews, only to discover, to my chagrin, that, and after the book had gone to press, that the title had been previously used by an important study of post-World War II Eastern Europe. So, similarly, And even more profoundly, David Nurnberg has just published a really amazing book called Anti-Judaism, which traces prejudices against Jews from ancient Egyptians to more or less the present day, finding a remarkable similarity from at least the period of medieval Europe to the present moment. In Florentine, English, and continental taxation policies, Elizabethan drama, in responses to mercantilism, capitalism, Hegelianism, in early, middle, and late Marxism, that is to say, in a depressingly wide series of venues, thinking about the imaginative figure of the Jew became the way that, in Nurnberg's phrase, Western culture thought about itself. That is to say, the terms provided the terms by which it negotiated social change and unsettling class, national, religious, etc. transformations. Zachary Levi-Strauss, in his formulation, may remind us that structuralism and historicism are not necessarily incompatible, and that one of the places they might be best seen as coming together is in the pensée sauvage of a Europe which followed 2,000 years of persecution, marginalization, and ghettoization, with an attempted genocide which otherwise, outside this context, looks inexplicable, but within it may appear to be inevitable. I disagree with Nurnberg in a few respects. In my own work, I use the term anti-Semitism that he rejects in favor of anti-Judaism because I see the rise of racial ideology that the former term, anti-Semitism, conveys to be coterminous with the West's encounter with the Jew. That is to say, race thinking is one of the chief pieces of work that gets done not only through, but also at times by Jews in the West. I would also differ from him in naming a specific historical moment for the origins of Western Christian anti-Semitism. Following great medieval historian C.I. Moore, I would nominate the Third Lateran Council of 1090, which, as Moore has shown, transformed Jews for the first time from just one minority group among many to the status of the theological enemy of the Christianizing state. Henceforth, to combine both of these two concerns, it seems to me that a degree of semiotic overdetermination attached to Jews which implicated them or transformed them into a model for other othernesses across the board. They moved from being subordinate or not unproblematic peoples to symbolically invested figures whose very being posed a unique challenge to the state, to the nation state, and to Christianity. Meanwhile, during this period, Jews attempted to construct their own relations with the culture, refiguring themselves as they came into contact with the figurations with which the culture met them. Although there's a constant negotiation and renegotiation to be understood between these two processes, it's this process of mutually modifying meaning-making that has formed the center of my work for the last 10 or 15 years or so. As I said at lunchtime today, I did this Jewish stuff, and I wanted to go off and do other things, and in the words of Al Pacino from The Godfather 3, they kept dragging me back in. Work which seems to me to be invigoratingly the sense of a whole generation of critics in modernist studies, postmodern studies, Jewish studies, and even what I would call Gentile studies, that is to say, the studies of the cultures of the West, from a position that understands the centrality of Christian identity politics to that configuration, which is what I see as Nurnberg's great contribution to get us outside and to look at the West as a consistently Christian-defining entity which defines itself over and over again at moments of crisis against the Jew. Now, this concern of the specific semiotic shape it takes doesn't come out of nowhere. It's been impelled by a number of different intellectual traditions. In my case, by U.S. ethnic studies and American studies at large. In the case of other critics, post-colonial studies, Brian Chadd's just written a wonderful book about the engagement between, secret sharer-like engagement between post-colonial studies and Jewish studies. And even Jewish theory itself, as manifested in the work of the Warren brothers, Jonathan and Daniel. And my concerns with meaning-making are hardly unique. I'd add to the roster of people doing this work such excellent work as Elizabeth Redneska's recently translated book, Return to the Jewish Question. Redneska, as you may or may not know, is a major interpreter of Lacan, who's herself half Jewish, and wrote this interesting book about the question juive, la question juive, excuse me. Or Aaron Graff Zivin's account of Latin American Jewish writing, which is called The Wandering Signifier, which gives you some sense of what where Aaron's coming from. And And the book that I want to use to focus my remarks today, Sarah Hammerschlag's excellent recent book called The Figural Jew, which I guess I left up in Richard's office. Indeed, what Hammerschlag does, Hammerschlag is primarily a Jewish studies scholar with a strong background in theory rather than the other way around, which is the case with the rest of the other people I mentioned. What she does is to meta us all by showing how the concern with the making of meaning and the insistencies of Jewish were interwoven in the work of post-war French theorists, those theorists who have become so important to the making of not only French but also Anglo-American criticism and theory in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. So from Sartre through Lyotard through Blanchot, ending up with, in dialogue with theorists like Levinas and Derrida, these critics staged their dialogue with history around the figure of the Jew. To simplify her rich argument into soundbite status, Hammerschlag argues that the discursive battle over defining the nature of the Jews who began in the fin de siècle, the last fin de siècle, the 19th century fin de siècle, to make their way into the precincts of French society becomes, in the hands of post-war French intellectuals, haunted by World War II and becoming aware of the existence of the Holocaust, a battle over the meaning of meaning itself, fought through the question of figuration. The classic wandering or deracinated Jew of French anti-Semitism was transformed by Sartre into a figure of the alienated universal condition in his famous 1948 book, Anti-Semite and Jew, and then constructed as the bearer of a transcendent ethic into human history by Levinas. A subsequent generation questioned this process, or at least questioned the moves by which Jews and/or Judaism might be seen as vehicles of universalism of any sort. But this critique was made without abandoning a commitment to the process of thought that brought Sartre and Levinas to such totalizing figurations in the first place. The work of all these critics, Hammerschlag shows us, is the construction of an ideal Jewish identity which flips the charge of deracination on its head, making the Jew into an emblem of exile or identityless non-identity, as in the case of, say, Derrida's embrace of the identity of the Ma'ana or the crypto Jew as a sort of a model, not just for himself, but for a politically viable form of identity. Perhaps more importantly for my purposes, they also turn first to figuration and then to the literary as a place where the dilemmas posed by Jewishness got variously worked out, whether the literary valorized as an abstract ideal, as by Blanchot, or instantiated in a dazzlingly linguistic sleight of hand, as by Derrida. For the literary qua literary, or the figurative qua figurative, serves as a means of putting into play the problematization of identity that congealed around Jews from the last fin de siècle to the most recent one, without insisting on one stable lesson that could be drawn from even so resonant a formulation. Now, while reading Hammerschlag's lucid and eloquent account, much more lucid and eloquent than I can be, of these theoretical fireworks, it's occurred to me that one way of resolving them, or at least translating them into a different key, might involve turning not to theory, but to actual works of literature, broadly construed as a species of knowledge on a par with, and in some ways perhaps even superior to, those on offer in high deconstructed discourse. Even a discourse like Derrida's, which systematically blurs the line between philosophical and literary formulations. Or more specifically, I want to turn outside to literature outside of either lyric, as in Celan, which all these critics often come back to call Celan, or theory, to the grand tradition of the European realist novel and its offshoots. Because it's in this tradition, I think, that we can see the problems that Hammerschlag presents responded to with the utmost of imaginative brio. So I'm going to begin with the novels of Marcel Proust, which put the identity of the Jew into a radically undecidable emotion which in turn does powerful work not just on a level of subjectivity, identity, or desire, but also on the level of cultural critique. In Proust's monumental and endless 7-volume Recherche de Temps Perdu, is, among the many other things that it aspires to be, obviously an inquiry into time, and an atomization of egotism, a sense of the probabilities of perspectivism, an account of the farther shores of human sexuality. Among these things, it's also a narrative of the entry of deracinated Jews into the precincts of French culture. And in this process, what we would call the Figural Jew, or in Proust's case, the sum total of identity markers that have come to a creep around Jews and Jewishness, become subject to an interrogation as this process continues and accelerates. The overall structure of the 7 volumes of the book details the gradual supersession of a beautiful, brilliant, bitchy, and attenuated traditional aristocracy by a new order containing a manifold of Jews in the parade of nouveau riches who come to take the place of the aristocrats, including among them the hideous novelist Albert Bloch, the appalling actress Rachel, successor and much inferior to the Jewish predecessor Burma, who's a portrait of Sarah Bernhardt, if you remember the novel, and perhaps even the most awful of them all, Madame de Verlaine, she of the little nucleus where Swann meets Odette and Swann in Love, which is the portion that everyone reads in high school and college, who, in an absolute apotheosis of hideousness, ascends to the position of the Princesse de Vermont at the end of the novel. I'm aware that you don't have all 7 volumes of Proust right in your brain, so I'll do my best to provide little mini summaries as things go along. I must say that I had the great experience 2 years ago of teaching all 7 volumes in 6 weeks at the Derrida School of English, and it really was sublime. So if you have 6 or 7 weeks available to yourself, I really recommend you sit down and start, because you will be transformed by the time you finish. So, to be sure, none of these figures are Jewish in any recognizable way at the end of the text, although they can't utterly efface the traces of their origins. Bloch, for example, starts off as sort of an awkward and sexually obsessed mooncalf and ends as one of the most prominent novelists of his time. And he sticks a monocle on his nose, thinking that he will efface the look of his Jewish proboscis. But of course, he only draws more attention to it as a result. But they profoundly change their culture in a way that befits a cultural stereotype of the Jewish as being associated with vulgarity, materialism, and cultural decline. And the novel limns a portrait of a culture that follows this path towards decline at its peril. A culture, in other words, which deracinates itself, and which does so by adopting deracinated Jews into their midst. Although Proust is half Jewish, one must never underestimate his own anti-Semitism structurally. Now, as well as other things. Now, merely to read the novel this way is to underestimate the complexity of its Jews and Jewishness. For mixed in with and over-determining this understanding of Jewishness as corruption is a sense in the text of Jewishness that affiliates Jewishness with vitality. Consider the question of sexuality. Like the Gentiles in the novel, Jews are affiliated with just about every form of sexual possibility under the sun. Krafft-Ebing, not Freud, I think Krafft-Ebing is actually Proust's great precursor here. Krafft-Ebing being sort of the great anatomist of sexualities. Had nothing on Proust as a student of the possibilities of perversity. So, for example, Monsieur Bernard, a minor character, a Jewish character, appears as queenie, as a gay man, as the hyper-aristocratic Baron de Charlus, who's the novel's archetypal gay man. His daughter is as out a lesbian as Marcel's lover Albertine is a self-closeting one. There's a lot of controversy as to whether Albertine is or is not a lesbian. I say she is. And Rachel, before she becomes a great actress, is an immensely inventive prostitute. Moreover, these are objects of Gentile desire throughout the text. Charlus's crush on Bloch leads him to an obscene fantasizing involving both of Bloch's parents, which is truly disgusting fantasies that he does. Robert Saint-Luc, the novel's portrait of the ideal French person, man, has a tumultuous affair with Rachel before settling on a half-Jewish woman, Charles Swann's daughter Gilberte, as his wife and the mother of his daughter, while dallying to Marcel's surprise with men. But given the inbred propensities of the aristocratic elite, it's interesting and important to note that it's only Jews who have the desire or the ability to reproduce. All of the Jews in the book have kids, including the overtly homosexual Gruisin. Few, if any, of the Gentiles do. And insofar as the book is leading up to its grand conclusion, which is the apotheosis of Charles Swann's granddaughter, Mademoiselle Saint-Luc, Gilbert, Charles Swann's daughter, marries Saint-Luc, and they produce this beautiful, beautiful, beautiful 16-year-old girl with whom the novel ends, which I'll talk about in a minute. It's both the desire that led to Gilbert's procreation and the fecundity that seems to attach to Jewish men and Jewish women, which makes this possible. So what Christ is doing is constructing a contradictory image of the Jew. The figure is made to mean two opposite things simultaneously. And this is most evident in the novel's treatment of that most stereotypical of signifiers of Jewish identity, the nose, about which I won't now talk. In many ways, a surrogate for Proust himself is Charles Swann, who is ethno-racially ambiguous. He's the son of a Jewish stockbroker who's fully at home in the aristocracy, although they treat him sometimes as an outsider or an insider. In one of the most beautiful and sad moments in the novel, Swann finds himself ill with cancer, sick at heart over the Dreyfus affair, and affirms before his friends, the Guermantes, his Jewishness, a fact that appears to Marcel as a species of, as a series of speech acts that leads to a physical metamorphosis which is reflected proboscilously, a word that I made up, which I'm very proud of. Although Marcel thinks that Swann is much changed due to his illness, this change is clearly the result not only of the lower status that he has in the world as a result of his marriage to Odette, but also Odette, who he falls in love with and has gender with, who's a courtesan, but also his newfound sense of himself as a Dreyfusard and a Jew. Swann, for example, describes the Guermantes' anti-Dreyfusism and anti-Semitism. Marcel, the narrator, denies this and then adds, quote, besides, having come to the premature term of his life, like a weary animal that is being tormented, he cried out against these persecutions and was returning to the spiritual fold of his fathers. He is becoming a Jew. Now, two things need to be noted about this metamorphosis. Since, as I said a couple minutes ago, it's his father, not his mother, who's Jewish, there's no reason for Swann to declare himself a Jew, except that he wants to do so. There's no halakhic reason. There's no actual reason in this world in which he lives. His Jewishness, then, is a matter of will or desire. And what's important is that from this willed Jewishness, a physiological Jewishness flows. For having proclaimed himself a Jew, Swann sees that his visage is remaking itself in the guise of his newly affirmed identity. And now here's a quote about Swann's nose. Whether because of the absence of his cheeks, no longer there to modify it, the cancer had been hollowed out his face, or because of arteriosclerosis, which is also a form of intoxication, had reddened it as with drunkenness, Swann's Puccinello nose, absorbed for long years into an agreeable face, seemed now enormous, tumid, crimson, the nose of an old Hebrew. In these last days, the physical type that characterizes his race was becoming more pronounced in him, at the same time as a sense of moral solidarity with the rest of his Jews. The rest of the Jews, a solidarity which Swann seems to have forgotten throughout his life, and which one after another, his mortal illness had reawakened. There are certain Jews, men of great refinement and social delicacy, in whom nevertheless there remains in reserve and in the wings, ready to enter the lives at a given moment, as in a play, a cad and a prophet. Swann had arrived at the age of a prophet. Now, it's in part, but only in part, Marcel's vision that defines Swann as a stereotypical Jew. For when he does this, in this description, Swann's place in a gallery of Jewish stereotypes is quite exact. Cancer remakes him in the image that Sandra Gilman has taught us to think about of the Jew as a bearer of disease, for example. And the description of his nose could have come out of any 19th century anti-Semitic screed, especially in the way in which its egregious phallicism, enormous, tumid, crimson, brings together all the associations typically ascribed to the Jews' possession of that organ. Not that Swan is hyperphallic here, as stereotypical Jews are. And you know, this whole image of the Jew as the sort of despoiler of Gentile women because he can't control, the Jewish man, because he can't control his sexual appetites, which is so important in Nazi propaganda, originates in Edouard Dumont, the French anti-Semitism of the late 19th century. Blame everything on the French, I'm sorry, but one frequently does, and it's not right, but anyway. But it's as if having willed himself into Jewishness, Swan becomes subject to a physiognomy that has a robust life of his own. His engorging nose proclaims his new life as a Jew, even as his physical life and his wasted body come to an end. Now, the same relation between body and Jewishness occurs at the end of the novel. The famous description, which I advertised earlier, of Mademoiselle Saint-Loup, a moment whose power in the text has caused no less astute a critic than Julia Kristeva to gush. Kristeva never gushes, but she gushes about Mademoiselle Saint-Loup. Her face is a masterpiece that blends the features of a swan with those of a Guermantes or an Odette or a Gilbert, writes Kristeva. It is the stimulus for the book itself, for it represents nothing less than the Proustian ideal of being and becoming, at once the ideal of time embodied. True enough, and one notes that the idealization by the narrator Marcel, by Kristeva, by any reader grateful enough to get to the end of the 7th volume, is accompanied by an emphasis on the pertness of her proboscis, and hence, metonymically, her un-Jewishness. Here's the passage in question. Mademoiselle Saint-Loup was standing in front of me. She had deep-set piercing eyes and a charming nose thrust forward in the form of a hook and curved, perhaps not in the least like that of Swan, but like Saint-Loup's. The soul of that particular Guermantes had fluttered away with his charming head as of a bird in flight, with his piercing eyes had settled momentarily upon the shoulders of Mademoiselle de Saint-Loup, and the sight of it there aroused a train of memories and dreams in those who had known her father. I was struck too by the way in which her nose, imitating in this the model of her mother's nose and her grandmother's nose, all Gentiles, was cut off by just that absolutely horizontal line at its base, by that same brilliant, if slightly tardy stroke of design. And it seemed to me wonderful that at the critical moment, nature should have returned like a great and original sculptor to give to the granddaughter, as she'd given to the mother and the grandmother, that significant and decisive touch of the chisel. I thought her very beautiful, still rich in hopes, full of laughter, formed from the very years which I myself had lost. She was like my own youth. It's a beautiful passage. However, it's also a weird passage, because the passage works around to celebrating the Gentilification of Mademoiselle de Saint-Loup, the extraction of Jewishness from the family line that her radiant perfection is taken to embody and perform. Her mother, Gilbert, has rejected her father. Swan has rejected her own sort of Jewish identity. Mademoiselle Saint-Loup is now sort of at the end of that process of the extinction of Jewishness. But is this really the case? After all, the description here of a curved, hooked nose is, which is as it were cut off by a Proustian nose job, is still all there in its beaky glory. The nose is curved and it's cut off, but it's still a hooked nose, right? Moreover, Mademoiselle Saint-Loup is not free of contact with Jewish stereotypes. There's deep, piercing eyes of her father and of her are as much an endowment of the classic Jew of 19th century anti-Semitism as is the hooked nose. Clement speaks of the Jew's hooked nose and deep-set eyes. Georges du Maurier's evil Jew Svengali in his novel Trilby, 1894, speaks of Svenvali's hypnotic eyes. Ethnologists and anthropologists did not hesitate to identify deep-set eyes as signs of Jewish identity. Now, to be clear, the genetic endowment that works itself out in her face is mixed. If the Guermantes line, like the stereotypical Jew, is distinguished by piercing eyes, and the hook nose, whether cut off or not, is as much a Guermantes as a Jewish phenomenon, one has to wonder what is going on. But this is precisely Proust's reason for using such ethno-racially overdetermined terms to describe aristocrats and Gentiles. Jew and non-Jew, aristocrat and commoner, all these possess versions of the same characteristic, distinguishable from each other only by virtues of the qualities one ascribes to the ambiguous or perhaps plurisignified feature in question. That such contradictory ascriptions, Jew, not Jew, hook nose, deep-set eyes, whatever, are not individual, the current and charged field of racial categorizations are being affirmed and enforced is a not always understood part of Proust's point. Or, to put it back in the language I was playing with earlier, the Proustian version of the Figural Jew was free of any connection to the actual Jewish body, each rendering the other increasingly ambiguous, but not unproductively so. Proust's point in bringing the two in contact with each other is to heighten the power of figuration itself, a power he understands to operate socially as well as individually, dialectically engaging with the biological body in a reciprocal process of construction and deconstruction, in which the figurative and the material shift back and forth in a process of redefining each other. My point here is that this undecidability is profoundly productive. It's not, I'm not doing this sort of a deconstructive number on you, it's going to leave you sort of alternating, between these two possibilities. It tells us much about the changing dynamics of family secular culture at large, about race, identity, and embodiment at that moment, and about race and identity and embodiment at that moment. In addition to illustrating the literary qua literary, in other words, the text shows us all the things that the literary can do. How much can be made to be put at stake in an ethical, human, cultural, and social level by the interplay between figurative description and human aspirations at play in Proust's text. Now, given the vicissitudes of the French educational system, it seems not unlikely that Proust's understanding of the interplay between figural descriptions of Jewishness and the deracinating destiny of actual Jews might have in some sense shaped Sartre, Derrida, Bodinesco, etc. They all read Proust when they were growing up, like Christeva, I don't have Derrida ever wrote on Proust, but I mean, why does Christeva decide at a certain point in her life that she's got to write on Proust? Because that's kind of what you do. And I'm not averse to this kind of thinking myself. I must say that since I read Proust all the way through, for the first time in 1995, I keep coming back to him over and over again in my thinking and writing, not only because he's so great, but because his mastery of 19th and 20th century novelistic invention shows us, as I just said, all the things that the literary can be and can do. In the current context, what's important about Proust for my argument is that he shows us how the mode of inquiry into which Hammerschlag sets us being carried on not only in philosophical theory, but also in the realistic or post-realistic novel. In its project. So I want to turn to that, another version of the same argument as it's worked out in different ways with different stakes in another form of realist / post-realist fiction, and that will be in the genre of film. And more specifically, in a film to which I'll return for a little while before returning to the questions that I posed at the beginning, the Coen brothers' amazing metaphysical comedy, A Serious Man. How many of you have seen A Serious Man? Okay, so I apologize. It was brought to my attention that I should show a clip from A Serious Man, but I don't have a clip to show you, so I'll act some of it out, I guess. So, in this movie, perhaps even more so than in Proust, figure and fact impact on each other. On the one hand, it's almost fanatically attentive to the details of middle-class, middle American Jewish life in the 1960s, the era during which the Coens grew up in Minnesota, Richard grew up in Chicago suburbs, and I grew up in Iowa City, Iowa. Rivenel and Prell has a wonderful essay showing the precision with which the Coen brothers recreate the Jewish suburb of St. Louis Park, in which they grew up. from the household decor to the theological blandness of the rabbis that preside over the congregation, to even to the use of the names of their own hated Hebrew teachers and a recreation of their own bar mitzvahs. Although I think without the marijuana, I'm not sure it's possible. You never know. Moreover, Gruisin historicizes the old Jewish environment, reminding us that Minnesota Jews faced a climate of resurgent anti-Semitism in the 1950s, which led them to cleave to their largely Jewish communities. So, given all that, the film seems to be highly realistic, highly mimetic, but it gestures through and beyond the Jewish community to Jewishness at large in order to reach, comically perhaps, to the archetypal, to the universal, beginning as it does with a quotation from Rashi and continuing through a series of allusions to the book of Job and ending with a whirlwind, a tornado, which is about to descend upon our protagonist. Not for nothing did Ethan Cohen, the younger of the two Cohen brothers, major in philosophy as an undergraduate. He and his brother had made the most Sartrean movie I know, one which continues the tradition that begins with anti-Semite and Jew, and plays with the contrast between figurative and non-figurative Jewishness, which leads to an undecidable structure in which ambitions, larger semiotic ambitions for the Jew, are placed in vibrant juxtaposition with the actual day-to-day historical experience of real-life Jews to indeterminate ends. So for those of you who haven't had the pleasure of seeing it, which means two of you, here's a brief synopsis. The film opens in that mythic place that Jeffrey Chandler has taught us to call Shtetl-land. An Eastern European Jewish couple confronts a visitor who may or may not be a malign spirit, a so-called Dibuk, played by Fable Flybush, who is a star of the Yiddish theater once upon a time. The wife at least thinks he's a Dibuk and stabs him in the heart with an ice pick to see if he will bleed, as Dibuks won't do. At first, he is untouched, and her suspicions are unconfirmed. But after a long minute and a half pause, blood appears, and he staggers out the door, complaining of the poor hospitality he has received. The spiritual and the local, the transcendent and the particular, come together in an irresolvable question. Is he a Dibuk or is he not a Dibuk? It is impossible to tell from the basis of the movie. So the Dibuk argument is he doesn't bleed, and then there's this long period, and if he's a Dibuk, he can presumably make blood appear. And the anti-Dibuk argument is, get stabbed in the heart, he bleeds. What more do you need to know? So, which is it? There is no answer that the film presents us. And the same dichotomy runs throughout the film as its characters attempt to explicate, respond to, or otherwise cope with the mundane tragedies and comedies of ordinary life. The movie focuses on the experience of Larry Gopnik, a Nebuchadnezzar physics professor up for tenure. Over the course of the film, Gopnik's life will leave him for Cy, an unctuous, I think he's a psychologist, I don't think he's named in the movie, but he's got to be a psychologist given what he has. Family friend who he keeps hugging. It's okay, I'm going to hug you. Who it turns out has been sending slanderous anonymous letters to his tenure committee. A student who will offer a bribe for a passing grade. His son Billy is developing a marijuana habit and has his transistor radio confiscated in Hebrew school. His daughter goes out with her friends at all hours and is angling for money to get a nose job. As his troubles, serious and comic, mount, Larry, a serious man indeed, turns to three rabbis for comfort and wisdom. The first offers him meaningless pabulum, a story about the beauty of God, known as he, she, or it is to observant Jews as Hashem, which as you all know means the name, shining into a parking lot. The second offers a more interesting parable, one in which the dentist finds Hebrew letters inscribed on a patient's teeth. He tries everything from deciphering them as signifiers to thinking of them as numbers and then thinking that they might be a telephone number, so he calls, gets the local pharmacy. He's finally freed from metaphysical speculation with the suggestion of a wise rabbi that they're actually a message is telling him to be a good person. The third rabbi won't meet with him at all, although Larry sees him sitting in his office. He's thinking, explains this guy's secretary. Things are looking pretty bad for Larry. He's living alone with his speckless brother in a local motel. His tenure prospects are not good. He's being harassed by the father of his foreign student, who threatens to sue him. Stressed, he gets into a car crash. But at that very moment, with one turn of the wheel of fortune, things look like they'll improve. Cy is killed in a car crash which occurs at the very moment Larry survives his. The tenure committee reports a favorable decision. His son, who's stoned out of his mind, nevertheless does a fine job at his bar mitzvah, and there's going to be clearly a reconciliation with his wife. But in the last minute of the film, things swing in another direction. Larry accepts his bride, and then, in rapid succession, is called with an ominous diagnosis by his doctor, and his son is trapped just outside the temple as a tornado bears down on them, and an ineffectual teacher struggles to open the shelter door. And teachers do not come across very well in this movie. Job-like indeed, although the Coens disavow the connection. But the movie is also, as I said earlier, filled in the minutiae of everyday life, with hardly a biblical reference to be found. Is the coalescence of the two dismissive of the grandeur of the biblical narrative that sort of clearly underwrites it? Or is it the opposite, a way of viewing the familiar text with quirky relevance, the way a rabbi or a minister does in the exemplum that they're giving? There's nothing when they're giving a sermon. There's nothing in the film to tell us either way. The quest for meaning that Larry undertakes yields similarly contradictory results. The significance is either there or not there, like the rabbi's parable of the tooth, which is either a fantasy of the pervasiveness of meaning in the world, even onto the goyim, as he says at one point, or a sign of its complete absence. I mean, it's really important in terms of the movie that it's a Gentile upon whose teeth the Hebrew letters occur. Similarly ambiguous are the words that the aged rabbi speaks to young Billy after the ceremony, bar mitzvah ceremony is over. Billy, you'll remember in that scene, still stoned out of his mind, goes to the rabbi's office, and the rabbi hands him his radio and then reminds him of the opening line of Jefferson Airplane's song, Somebody to Love. And when the truth is found, to be lies, and oh, joy inside you dies. What then, he says. And then reminds him also that the members of that canonical 1960s band, who I must just confess I listened to under various forms of intoxication, that's not mentioned here, were all Jews who knew Grace Slick, Marty Balin, Jorma Kaukonen, as they pronounce his name, Paul Kantner. And he leaves him with this advice: be a good boy. Now, are these words utterly meaningless, or are they full of profundity? Do they mean nothing, or do they mean live your life ethically as a man in the way in which we have tried to teach you to do as a child? And that's which is the meaning of the bar mitzvah ceremony, after all. Who knows? The ultimate image of this doubleness is the physics conundrum that Larry puts on the board, Schrödinger's cat, which is a famous thought experiment in which, and please don't ask me for details, because I don't understand them, in which a cat in enclosed space can turn out either to be dead or alive at one and the same time. So there's no better image, it seems to me, than the undecidability to which high deconstructive theory aspires to in this moment, unless it's the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, which Larry also puts up on the board in another sequence in the movie, arguing that, quote, it proves we can't ever really know what's going on, so it shouldn't bother you, though you will be responsible for it on the midterm, which are lines I think we can all live by. But what follows is equally significant, and I would argue Hammerschlagian. I think Sarah would be really upset with what I'm doing to her name, but whatever. The student who complains about receiving the poor grade in physics says, well, I get the physics, I don't understand the math underlying it. I understand, he says in halting English, the dead cat. Larry, who doesn't understand the dead cat at all, is nonplussed. And he responds, you can't really understand the physics without understanding the math behind the physics. The math tells you how it really works. That's the real thing. The stories I give you in class are just illustrative. They're like fables, say, to help you give a picture. And in perfect mode. I mean, even I don't understand the dead cat. The math is how it really works. And remember that on the board, which I'm told, again, I take no responsibility for this point, I'm told is actually the math. Accurate. I mean, how do I know? It could be like X's and Y's, and that's obvious, but anyway. So, math and physics, truth and parable, Hashem and human are set against each other at this moment, as they are over and over against in the film. Like the Dybbuk, not a Dybbuk, or the live dead cat, or the wave particle, they alternate with each other to no final end. Or do they? It seems to me that while neither the math nor the physics are actually accurate, that the parable is the only accessible modality in this movie. In other words, like Proust, but in an even more self-conscious postmodern guise, the film points to the parabolic, the figurative, or the literary as a means of knowledge. The knowledge thereby yielded is not necessarily social in nature, in fact it's metaphysical in nature, and it's not necessarily positive. What it yields may be just ambiguous, like the Jewish parables that the movie is parodying, especially in its version of the three rabbis. But this is no simple return to tradition and parable and folktale a la Fiddler on the Roof or other such abominations. Its turn into a traditional Jewish narratives evokes a postmodern uncertainty in a traditional guise, which breaks down the gap between the two of them. It breaks down, in so doing, also the universalist particularist divide at the center of theory's treatment of the question of the Jew, seeing the contradictory nature of the Jews and the contradictory expression of the Jewish tradition itself as a key to the undecidability, which is carried forth in terms of parables that convey contradictory nature arguments without resolving them. It also deconstructs the presentist dimension to many of the arguments that Sarah Hammerschlag is writing about, lending my credence to my invocation of the possibility of a structuralist historicism at the beginning of this talk. When Larry Brother howls at the swimming pool at one point, you may remember he's completely bummed out. He's been arrested for gambling, he's been arrested for sodomy, his life is terrible, and he cries out, Hashem, Hashit, at that moment. It's really comic, but it's also a really resonant updating of the central problematic of Job, reminding us that while swimming pools may be relatively recent, there's nothing new under the sun. There is a God, there is not a God. If there is a God, how come life is shit? That's basically the point of Job. That's basically the point that is being articulated so brilliantly at this moment. So what, in conclusion, happens when we return with this larger conception of the Jewish as put into instantiation by what I'm calling the literary or the imaginative to Hammerschlag's concerns, and with the semiotic questions at the center of so much of recent writing about Jews and Jewishness. It reminds us through works that I foregrounded Proust and the Coen brothers bring together history and theory, semiosis and subjectivity into a resonant and ultimately polyvalent whole, which offers us things that neither the philosophical nor the historical traditions can give us vis-a-vis the figurative Jew. For one of the things that the literary, and specifically the high mimetic form of the 19th century novel and its successor, the 20th century narrative film, can be or do is to put into play a particularist universalism which stands simultaneously inside and outside of history, which can paint us a socially grounded vision which doesn't demand an exilic or Morano identity a la Derrida, or for that matter, any other kind of identity formation at all, but which instead uses to appertain to the Jew, which instead uses the cultural ambivalences built into the Jew qua Jew, which is interrogated by the Jewish artist and the world which is represented in the Jewish tradition itself, to provide a model of doubleness which can then get put to historical and or metaphysical work without in any way positing a universalist take on them. In other words, because it's rooted in the undecidability of Jewish identity in the modern world, undecidability can't get totalized or universalized in these works. Because it's grounded in the insistent posing of larger questions through the culture, our culture's habit of thinking through these issues by means of the Jew, particularism can't congeal into a politics or even a poetics of identity. Or to put it yet another way, Proust, the Coen brothers, and a host of other people that I'm writing about these days, which include the great French novelist Albert Camus, Italian novelist Italo Svevo, Israeli novelist Abi Yehoshua, Yiddish novelist Isaac Bashevis Singer, American novelist Saul Bellow, and even Lena Dunham, who's one of the great auteurs of our time, Lisa and I agree, form the center of my work these days because both by means of their construction by the culture at large and by means of their pushing back against those constructions, they generate great responses to the big questions of our time, of any time, which remain productively volatile in ways that ought to excite our admiration as they generate our fascination. At any rate, I hope today I've given you a short taste of what they have to offer, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. Thank you.
I have a question, and I have to run
I know everyone has
ask
one,
that
so I
question.
have to
So I just, it's my leaving the room after asking the question and hearing your answer does not indicate some satisfaction with your answer. So,
Well, it does not preclude it.
it doesn't. That's right. Yeah. So I had a question about something that sort of I was wondering about as you were talking, and then you sort of mentioned it in passing towards the very end there, and that has to do with the relationship between the literary as such and the sort of category of the realist or the post-realist. And one of the reasons I'm inclined to ask this is because it struck me at first that I'm not sort of in a knee-jerk way would describe either Proust or A Serious Man as particularly realist. They seem to me to have a set of other sort of aesthetic and moral concerns that are sort of outside that rubric. And I also was thinking like, well, maybe the sort of parabolic and the way that the figurative works, for instance, in theory, seems to me to be different than the kind of language of the realist novel, which seems to be a bit more constrained. Except that then I was struck by the possibility that what you were saying was that insofar as the realist novel precisely puts into play the relationship between the universal or the archetypal or the archetypical and the particular, or what you described as the minutiae, that it's something about that relationship that's interesting to you. I was thinking about the way that so much of your reading of the Proust novel is about character, and of course it's precisely that relationship of character to the particular universal dialectic that is of importance to the realist novel. So I was just sort of curious if you could say something about that.
Short answer to your question is yes. I'll try to give you like an answer in the minute and a half that you have before you have to go where you have to go. Really important and influential book for me when I was really young was Sartre and Levinas, The Gates of Horn, which I don't know if people still read it or not, but one of the things that, you know, the Gates of Horn and the Gates of Ivory and the Odyssey, it's the Iliad, and one is the Gates of Dream and the other is the Gates of Reality. And the Gate of Reality is the realist novel, but the Gate of Ivory is always there. There's always this complicated dialectic between universal and particular in the terms that Hammerschlag would use, and between what Dr. Freud would call the low mimetic and the sort of the crazy, which is always sort of working itself out. So I do read Proust. Obviously, you know, there's a paragraph I cut out comparing Proust to Joyce and Rushdie, who I think is actually the inheritor of tank versus in particular of this tradition of the Muslim taking place of the Figural Muslim. But what I think is so fascinating about Proust, I don't read him really finding, in the end, you're right, as a modernist, but as a continuator of the dialectic between the Gates of Horn and the Gates of Ivory that we see in Balzac. You know, if you read, oh my God, you remember if you took elementary French trying to get through the name of all those pieces of furniture at the beginning of the Gregory. Oh my God. And yet, at the same time, the story and plot couldn't be any more sort of magical. And you know, so when people start going on about magical realism, they say, oh, all that, you know, that dialectic is there in the first and built into the realist novel, which is why I am drawn to it as a way of dealing with the issues that Sarah's dealing with in her book, because it seems to me a vehicle in which all these things that she sees as being sort of brought together in these are very highfalutin and to my mind, ultimately evasive ways in Derrida, not in Blanchot exactly, but in Derrida. Or to use another example that she only talks about, that Paul Celan is always dealing with in his poetry, which is great, but I'm just not a poetry person, I guess, at heart. But I see the realist novel as really this site, literally, where so much of this stuff happens. And what happens in the realist novel is it becomes, you know, Proust does what he does to it, you know, start talking about the modernist novel, and we start talking about Ulysses and so on and so forth. And And I really do see that tradition ending with Proust as well, and the tradition of the 19th century realist novel continuing in narrative film. I really think film picks up where the 19th century novel ends up. A, because it's for the same, it's for a large public, not for an elite audience, the way that James and Joyce are writing. And B, because it continues that sort of narrative engagement with the real and the not real, or whatever you might want to put it. The iconic and the indexical, I mean, whatever term you want to put. That's a really quick answer, but I hope it addresses your question, which is a really good question. Thank you. Yeah.
Can I ask about decadence? Turning your attention to decadence. I was just remembering the number of half-Jews that show up in various decadent work. I think of Judah Barnes' Nightwind as an example. So I was thinking about this half-Jewishness of Swann inherited from the father, so to speak, and the way in which, I guess I've always read that, when it shows up as kind of decadent feature, as a sort of an elective non-normativity rather than a hereditary non-normativity. So that what's important about that is that Jewishness becomes like homosexuality. It's something you chose because you didn't get it from your mother, you sort of elected to have it. And that's precisely what puts you kind of outside of white Protestant normative, non-decadent, right, culture core that the decadence in many ways is trying to escape. So I just wondered about the ways in which the half-Jewishness, the elective Jewishness, might be related to the sort of undecidable Jewishness that we're talking about in other ways.
So one thing you could say, and you wouldn't be totally wrong if you said it, is that in Proust, decadence is like homosexuality, because everyone's homosexual and everyone's Jewish. Sorry. I mean, everyone's gay in one way or another, except for Marcel, who's clueless. And everyone's Jewish in one way or another, except for maybe for one or two of the isolated characters. Elective versus
Essentialized.
So there are two things going on. First, one thing that's going on is the Swann situation matches exactly, but inversely Proust's, where Proust has a Jewish mother and a Protestant, a Catholic father. So that there's a kind of a weird sort of, I mean, there's all this stuff about Swann as Proust and Proust as Swann. But that's not what's important to me in responding to your question. I think what's most important to me in responding to your question is that whether Swann is or is not Proust, is or is not Jewish, he's treated as such by everyone. So that, is anyone here from the French department? Good. So my French is really bad. And I spent about 6 weeks in Tel Aviv hacking my way through Proust in French. It was very hard, and I did not do a great job. But one thing that I learned when I did it was reading Swann and Love in French. I became really, really aware of the ways in which all sorts of coded language of otherness, borders, passports, all sorts of terms like that were used to describe Swann. His passport into high society. His other, he was like them, but he was different from them. The narrative of Swann is also, I mean, what we call it today, we call it sex addiction, I suppose. But he's an embarrassment to his friends because whenever he goes to a country resort with them, or a country house with them, he is caught trying to seduce the maid, or caught trying to get the farm girls nearby to sleep with him or something. And this is a description of a kind of a sort of a promiscuous, sexual stuff. There's also, classic Drumontian anti-Semitic description. So what actually drew me originally to thinking about this topic in terms of Sarah's book is that there's this wealth of figurative significations that surround Swann, even though he does not perceive himself to be Jewish. Marcel's grandfather, who thinks everybody is Jewish, says, well, Swann's Jewish, we all know Swann's Jewish. He pretends not to be, but, he really is. And everybody else treats him exactly that way, except for he himself. So this is stuff, obviously, that I had to cut out for reasons of time. Whenever you do Proust, you basically end up talking for 4 hours, or you just have to say, oh, I had to cut that out. But the ways in which Swann's discovery that he is a Jew at the moment of the Dreyfus affair, which is the great dividing line for everybody, is in some sense undercut by the fact that everybody's seen him that way all along. Just as the fact that it's this heartbreaking moment when Auerbach writes about its heartbreakingness, right? Where Swann says to his best friends, I'm going to die. And they say, we have to go to a party now. I mean, that's basically what happens at the end of the book, the third book of Hammerschlag. And it's heartbreaking in exactly the same way. I'm a Jew. Yeah, we all know that. This great ethical discovery of his part is undercut in that way. So just to get back to your question, I think that what's going on here, from my point of view, is that the figurative Jewishness is cut free from any actual ascription to individual bodies and just sort of, floats around. Mademoiselle Summit is as much a Jew as Madame Verdurin, which is to say not much at all. But everyone perceives one as a Jew and the other is not, because she's a vulgar Arabist, and Mademoiselle Summit is this beautiful 16-year-old innocent. So, Dybbuk? Not a Dybbuk. Show of hands for those who've seen the movie.
Oh, was it?
Yeah.
That's not the point. Can I just
Please.
sort of, to go to the film, because you're talking about the sort of, everybody's a Jew in Proust. Well, everybody really is a Jew in Serious Man, except for
the Goyim.
Except for the Goyim. So I want to ask you about the Goyim. Because we have two sort of very interesting, and it's been a while, so forgive me if there are others and I don't remember, but the Korean student, right, and his father, who says, accept the mystery, and the father will say, well, it was a bribe and it wasn't a bribe, but there's the sort of Korean and immigrant, right, and then we have the sort of the hunter neighbor who's besieged by Jews and looking So talk about those. It's interesting to talk about the Figural Jew in a film like this, where we are in this hermetic Jewish universe. What do you think about this character?
So that's a wonderful question. First of all, Rivel's piece is so wonderful because one of the things that she does is to talk about the old Jewish nature of this world. Iowa City, where I grew up in as a Jew, is not like this. I mean, there were Jews, there were non-Jews. I was the only kid in my class who was a Jew. I had to explain Hanukkah to people. There was this service down the street. We went to high holidays, but that was it. But this is a truly organized Jewish community in the suburb. And one of the things that Rivel does, which is so good, is to talk about the social and historical conditions that caused Jews on the plains to turn inwardly at that moment. There were sort of vaguely anti-Semitic nativist candidates going around, for example. And there's a paranoia in the film about the Goyim. I mean, at various moments, people in the film will talk about, the Goyim, like the Goy who has, as if there are different species, like the Goy who's got the Hebrew letters and so on and so forth. The two that you mentioned are really fascinating, and then what happens with them is fascinating. So, like you, as you imply, I think, I read the Korean immigrants as non-Jew Jews, who are mono-minority types, who don't get it. They think that they can bribe their way into the kind of academic success that Jews found in the 1950s and 1960s in physics departments and math departments and English departments and so on and so forth. But they don't get it. And remember that the son who doesn't get it is followed by the father who doesn't get it but is vaguely threatening, which makes him an honorary Goy. But remember also, because the Goys are threatening, right? But remember also that the neighbor, who is an anti-Semite, walks up to Larry and says something like, is he giving you in trouble? Is he bothering you?
Yes.
No. Because there's a complicated discourse going on, which I can't quite figure out yet, about, sort of belonging and not belonging. When you belong to a community, what kind of, the Jew is only accepted by the goy at the moment when the Jew is presented with another, or the goy is presented with another more egregious form of otherness. You know, if the Asian American guy had been black, you know, we would have read that, I think, even more fully that way. But it's a really rich and complicated moment. And then there's the madman-esque, you know, neighbor who, on the other side, who someday is nude and gets Larry stoned for the first time, and who he fantasizes having sex with. And at one point in talking to her, he comes over, and remember his wife has left him, and he's alone, and he's kind of interested in her, and he gets stoned with her, and he says something, but even before that, he says something really awkward, like, you know, I live next door, which he doesn't really, and if you ever need any help around the house, just let me know. And she says, are you that nice to the neighbor on the other side? He says, no, we don't talk about it, because she's Jewish too. So this is just a long way of saying this complicated gradation in the neighborhood itself of forms of community belonging, otherness, what's included, what's excluded. And but Larry and the next door neighbor, whose husband is put on the road, are potential outsiders in the Jewish community, you know, potential outsiders in the world of family and communal life. You know, what happens, you know, Larry's been put under pressure to get his wife a get, you know, even though, I mean, he doesn't even know what a get is at that point. So he's kind of an outsider, she's kind of an outsider. Next door, there's this menacing goy, and then there's the Korean students. It's a very complicated set of gradations, and I'm talking too much, so that's my answer.
So I'll ask you about Job. I mean, my reading of Job is fairly conventional, which is, you know, God says at the end, it's not your business to know, and I'm more powerful than you, and hence the tornado. And so, I mean, is undecidability, is that the reading of, I mean, is that where Serious Man comes down? At the end of the film, it's just, you know, you're asking the wrong questions about, you know, truth and lies and so forth, and, you know, I'm going to just come, and even if it means lots of people are going to die, that's the message, that, you know, that I am God and I am all powerful.
That's one reading at the end. Another reading at the end is survival of the tornado. I don't think there's any, the movie doesn't end with everybody dying.
Right.
There's a tornado. People survive tornadoes. Larry, I'm not so sure about, because the doctor says, I really think you should come in. Not clear sometime for us to talk. It's pretty clear that he's not going to last too long. But I do think the film ends consciously as Job does not. This is the point of the thing I said at the very beginning. There's no voice that comes out of the whirlwind. It's just a tornado. It's a whirlwind. It's a tornado. It's a whirlwind. It's a tornado. It's cancer. It's divine judgment for having given that kid a grave. It's cancer. I don't see any. I mean, I understand, and I think you have successfully outlined any reason to believe that there's divine inscrutability being valorized at the end of the movie any more than it's just a tornado. But I don't see any reason to believe that it's just a tornado is valorized at the end of the movie any more than divine inscrutability. So that's my reading. It's undecidable as to whether your reading or my reading is right. But pick your reading.
Great. Well, thank you.
Well, thank you all.